I would say make application portfolio management an organizational responsibility. Application sprawl is real. Our inventory is going to explode. We're all impacted by our budget. We're all impacted by security. We're all impacted if our system goes down, right? So we want to make sure everyone is accountable for whatever things we're putting into our ecosystem.
It's easier to get software into your organization than out of it. Suddenly, a series of reasonable decisions leads to application sprawl, redundant tools, duplicated resources, and excess cost and risk. With more SaaS solutions than ever, it has never been harder to get visibility into your true applications portfolio. The cost and risk are still there, and IT is still accountable. So rationalizing your portfolio is more important than ever, and is key to making sure you're getting value and performance from each tool. Joining me here today to talk about how we can rationalize our application portfolios is Research Director Andrew Kumson. Andrew, thanks for being here today.
Happy to be here.
Amazing. So, Andrew, maybe in your own words, why is it important? Why do we need to care about application rationalization?
You can't operate without applications. And unfortunately, a lot of our investments have been tied up in an application. So we want to make sure that we're getting the most return, get the most output from that.
So, with that in mind, what do you find tends to be, the best trigger? Or, if you were an applications leader trying to, shoot a flare upwards in the organization to get resources for this, what would you suggest in terms of messaging that might resonate?
It's a very tough question because when I talk with organizations who are in the government, in a public organization, to some extent, cost is not a huge issue, right? They're willing to absorb a little more cost than some of the private types of organizations. However, what they can't do is making sure that, hey, we have shadow IT that's going on, or hey, we have a security risk, or hey, I have an issue with actually figuring out what to spin up first, right? Because as a government organization, uptime is very critical. If you want to flip the switch to the private organization, it's really about, hey, I'm running so much cost and all of my budget is going towards licensing. I have some issues when it comes down to regulatory or industry compliance. So the driver is a little bit different between if you're looking from a private and from a public sector.
Right.
But it really depends on the organizations on that side.
But if I'm hearing you correctly, cost, risk and compliance, agility maybe are some of the bigger ones we're seeing.
Shadow IT, disaster recovery, uptime. In some cases, it's the employee or the end user experience that derives from it. Sometimes it's also dealing with issues with regarding to innovation, because sometimes I'm like, hey, I want to implement AI, I want to implement cloud, and I don't necessarily want to do it on an application that's very poor technical health, right? So sometimes using that rationalization does kind of give a little more confidence in that direction I want to head down towards.
Right. So, when I think about, why we would do this today and the state of applications management versus, 10 or 15 years ago, how is it different, and what impact does being in, for many organizations, almost a SaaS first environment have on this initiative?
I think one of the biggest challenges many organizations facing is how quickly solutions are sprawling these days, right? There are things like we have in the past with regarding to Access databases and macros, has a lot of access to a lot of applications, and they go unchecked, right? Because everyone can build up on their own. And once we actually look at the technologies today, like you mentioned, SaaS, low and no code, if you're familiar with like Power Apps, Power Automate, it's just so easy to actually create and implement applications. So definitely one of the biggest challenges is how do we get hold of these, understand in terms of what we have. And that's really kind of pushing a lot of organizations to not just implement application portfolio management as a capability, but as an ongoing practice.
Right. So from your perspective, is the risk and the cost of not doing this getting worse or getting better?
It's getting a lot worse, just because technology is becoming a lot more pervasive as well as a lot more easy to access, right? This is going right back to the whole citizen development, shadow IT, business managed application side of things. And if you're not able to grasp in terms of what you have, you're going to encounter a lot of issues and challenges and risks and costs going to be down the road. So to your point, if you don't actually have a good handle on it now, it's going to be quite painful later on.
So let's jump into some of the key insights we've got from the research. And, the first and maybe most all-encompassing one is that, first of all, this is not something that should be outsourced. This, as we think about, application management, strategy, this is something that really needs to live in-house with IT. Can you maybe, expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so you can kind of think of it as you don't want to have someone else holding your keys. You don't want other people kind of overseeing the house, the renovations that you have in your home. So you want to make sure that you do have a firm understanding in terms of what applications you do have, where is its trajectory, where is it going to be used, who's going to be using it, and where your budget and costing is going to go. You don't want to have that outsourced because they don't understand. They don't know in terms of how you effectively operate. So you want to keep that in-house. And definitely that does require a high degree of visibility, right, in terms of what you do have. You have to figure out in terms of what are the prospective changes that are coming about. You have to understand who your end users are, right? And you can't expect an outsourcing partner or vendor to do that. Only you know what you need.
Right. So when we think about, this kind of center within the organization for, the management and governance of applications, today we're talking about application portfolio management. We're talking about rationalization. Just very broadly, where does that fit in the bigger picture of what an organization should hold, internally in the apps governance space?
There are two different things I normally think about when it comes down to your applications practice as a whole. One of them is what do you have, and that's your application portfolio management. And the other one is in terms of how you're going to deliver and support it. You can't look at them separately. You have to look at them together because they kind of dictate and influence one another. They have to kind of work together. All of that kind of bridges together in terms of what comes into your applications department, which all ties together into an application strategy. And without that, it becomes very difficult of being able to deliver value, but also implementing the right practices to ensure that you're actually delivering that value. So that's going to where from there, we kind of see that organization start to say like, hey, once I have that good foundation set, so being able to manage my applications and being able to deliver and support them, that's going to where we see organizations venturing into, hey, how can we implement product-centric delivery? How can we implement product lifecycle management? How do we implement a lot of these other leading edge, trending types of practices and technologies that we want to put it into there? It just starts with that foundation.
Got it. That makes complete sense. Andrew, one of the insights you've got in the research here is all about a common definition of applications. Why is that important? And do we have any guidance in terms of what is or is not an application in this sense?
If we're looking at it from what is defined as an application, it becomes very important because it does kind of answer basically three different questions. Should it be included in my inventory? Should I even be rationalizing and assessing it? And should I even go into my roadmap? And it's quite easy to have people kind of think about applications as like an infrastructure application, like a load balancing application, like a networking application. But if you kind of think about it, that's going to explode your inventory to such a degree that it becomes very difficult to actually manage. So that's kind of why, as part of application portfolio management, in terms of how we would look at it, is that let's kind of focus on the business-facing applications, the ones that are kind of driving clearly business value associated with that. We're not saying that the infrastructure and networking application is going to be pushed aside, but there are other tools and other mechanisms to help support that, like IT asset management, for example. But there are certain common traits that gets translated up into those business applications, like the technical health regarding to that. So then we also need to make sure that we understand in terms of where does business manage end user created applications integrating, because like does an Excel chart counts as one? Does a Access database counts as one? Does a Power Apps? In some instances, yes, some instances, no. But we just have to make sure that whatever definition that we kind of fall under based on what the organization is looking for, we just have a consensus in terms of what does that entail and understand the costs that are associated with different definitions associated with that.
Well, and it sounds like that decision is a really pragmatic one in terms of like, if it's this hard to even get, buy-in or resources to do this, we need to scope it appropriately and figure out where the value is.
Absolutely. I mean, this is no different from saying like, hey, I want to deliver a high quality application. What does quality mean? Or I want to define what is a high value application. What does value typically mean, right? So you're absolutely right. We just need to make sure we have a consensus in terms of what we mean, and that can help kind of define what the scope is, right, of the practice we want to put into place.
So when we think about the actual value of an application, it's convenient to think about it as, it's the functionality functionality that provides the value. But that's not exclusively the case. How do you and how do we think about application value?
As you have rightfully mentioned, a lot of the interpretations of an application value is based on the functionality it provides, right? Am I able to process these sales claims? Am I able to conduct underwriting with these applications, right? That's all well and good, right? But there is a very interesting perspective that you would also have to take. It's around the service, the operational management around that. Because what we would often like to say is that today's modern application is tomorrow's shelfware, right? There is a high possibility that your applications are not going to become valued very quickly. So how do we ensure that we're maintaining a high sense of value for those applications is to say like, hey, are we doing road mapping? Hey, are we actually engaging with folks? Hey, are we actually taking in requirements and requests and being able to deliver them? Are we able to get in hand and get in touch with those end users so that they can understand and be onboarded properly with those applications itself?
Right. And it sounds like, through that lens, like application rationalization is not really like a one and done. To actually make this effective on an ongoing basis, we need to be thinking about some of these activities that keep our application portfolio clean.
Correct. And that's kind of why, as part of one of the key exercises that we always have as part of this research, is to say, hey, we done it the first time. How do we keep the ball rolling? How do we keep it going, right? Because audits is not going away. Our budgets cycles are not going away. Changes are not effectively coming, right? So we definitely do need to make sure that the investments that we're putting in now has some ongoing longevity to it. And we can only do that by actually doing application portfolio management.
What are the best organizations doing differently? What does this whole process look like when it's really successful?
So one of the things is that they are implementing application portfolio management as a recurring exercise. So whether that's slightly before their IT strategy, annual strategy review and development, or right after, it's up to them, right? But it's a reoccurring basis. But it does not necessarily mean that application rationalization does not happen throughout the year, because there's a lot of good data that does come in. So that's kind of where I'm seeing a lot more organizations starting to figure out, say like, hey, let's do an evaluation of the service desk tickets come in and take a look at the patterns, right, of some of the issues that do come up. Let's take a look at some of the end users or the stakeholder requests that are coming in and say, are they looking for a specific feature, right? Are they specifically looking for something, right, that we don't necessarily do have? Let's get in touch with the end users themselves, because one of the things I'm getting with our members to start thinking about doing a little bit more is, get out of your hole of IT and start talking with the end users, right? Apply certain practices like Gemba, be where the value is greater, so you can understand and be immersed in terms of how applications are being developed. And that just makes it a whole lot easier to create the right recommendations, the right direction in terms of ensuring that applications are being adopted. So that's kind of one of the things I'm trying to get members to think about, is yes, you want to make it recurring, but this is also a reoccurring exercise that's going on throughout the year. So that's one. The other thing I'm getting our members to think about is, like we talked about earlier, is the fact that applications, SaaS solutions, low, no code, it's just so much easier to implement, so much easier to acquire, so much easier to build. And you can't expect IT to be on the ball all the time, as much credit as I want to give them.
Right.
So how can we address that? Well, I would say make application portfolio management an organizational responsibility. Why can't we have someone from the business actually managing their own set of inventory that's a little bit more up to date, a little more relevant, and periodically update IT around that? So that's kind of why I'm trying to get members to start thinking about the fact that, application sprawl is real. Our inventory is going to explode, but how can we ensure that it's not just IT responsibilities, but how can we actually share that responsibility among the organization itself?
I love that. And, it really sounds like, if everybody kind of chips in and we can all agree that this is important, it's actually something we can get our arms around and can get some real results from.
Absolutely, because we're all impacted by our budget. We're all impacted by security. We're all impacted if our system goes down, right? So we want to make sure everyone is accountable for whatever things we're putting into our ecosystem.
Joining us here on our panel today, we have Research Director Andrew Kumsoon, we have AVP of Research Ari Glazel, and we have Practice Lead Rob Fail. Thanks, gentlemen, for being here today. So let's jump right into it. One of the biggest issues, I've found in my past life with helping applications leaders with application rationalization is there's a risk or a tendency of starting the whole exercise with, okay, let's get out your application inventory and we'll start there, and just getting these blank stares because, an application inventory is a little bit of a scarcer resource than you might hope in the life and world of an application manager. Is this a prerequisite for application rationalization? And how, if at all, does this come into play?
Yeah, so a lot of the folks we've been speaking to is pretty much what you have nicely illustrated there. A lot of the people who do come in do have something. It's just a question of how current, how relevant it effectively is. And unfortunately, you can't rationalize something what you don't have. So that's kind of where we talk with organizations, be like, hey, you got to have something there, something to start with, so that we can have a little bit of indication in terms of where you want to go from there. But yes, I would recommend that we start building your inventory first, but you don't need to have it to start our engagement.
So I'm going to make a stronger statement than that. I'm saying, don't bother if you can't write it down. And so I'm going to make an analogy to the physical world a little bit away from software. So let's say, for example, you decide that it's time to, rationalize your behavior, rationalize what you eat, become healthier. What's the first step? It's not go to the gym and start pressing 200 pounds and every day is leg day and whatever that is. The first thing you do is start writing down and taking stock of your current activity. And we recognize that because we have a few things that Infotech offers to help. We have an application snapshot concierge service to help you with some techniques around taking that snapshot of your applications here, of your application portfolio. It's a lot of work, and it's not, it's not simple. All you have to do is write it down. It's not quite that simple, but you need to start there.
So I want to push on this a little bit, Ari. We talk about writing things down. Are we talking exhaustive? In the metaphor here of like tracking what you eat, do you need to have a list of every application in the shop for this to work? Or, in practice, where do you stop? Where do you draw the line?
So what we recommend is, so first of all, you can't write everything down because some of it is, especially if you're talking a very large organization, right, with lots of M&As that have happened and a lot, and 30 years of delivering value and actually doing business, you build up a lot of, what I'll call things in the corner. Those things sitting on the, that Excel macro that's sitting on the side of someone's desk that happens to be running the entire department. Yeah. Right. Those kinds of things. You may not know where those things, you may not know where all of those things are. So you need to at least take stock of the most critical applications that run your business and start there.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. When you have a large portfolio, it can be daunting. I was talking to one member who was global manufacturer and grown by acquisition. They had 15 different ERPs globally.
Wow.
And 4 of those were different instances of SAP. So one platform, but not even the same instances and versions. So you've got to narrow it down. And as Ari said, is rather than be overwhelmed with the volume of applications, like this one manufacturer, they had about 1,200 applications worldwide. You can't do that. So focus in on what's important. Your ERP, your CRM, your supply chain, the stuff that delivers the most value to the organization, start there and use that as your testing bed on how do we do this, and really see that value acceleration that comes out of the exercise, and then apply it to the less valued pieces, which will still drive value for the organization.
When we think about this inventory, when we think about this exercise, what should be rationalized, there are some myths flying around about what applications should be included or excluded. I've heard, if it's SaaS, then it doesn't really qualify for application rationalization, or even as far as this is really only for, some of our homegrown stuff. In your minds, do either of those hold water? What should be the scope when we think about types of applications?
So a couple things. So first of all, when we're talking about applications, and we talk about this in the research, is come to an agreement amongst yourselves, what is an application, first and foremost, right? To some people, it could be that Excel macro sitting on the side of someone's desk. You could call that an application. In other organizations, that's not acceptable for a variety of political reasons or other reasons, but have a concise definition, because with rationalization, you're going to be reaching across your specific department. And so at least first of all, have at least some kind of notional agreement to start on what is an application. So that's first of all. Now, when it comes to how we would scope, how it would scope what an application would be, is it solving a particular problem? Is it delivering value? Is it delivering value? And is there some notion of maintenance or budget attached to it? And again, these are again high-level guidance points. We're not saying that that's the only thing you should be using. And if you can answer those kinds of basic questions about that thing,
Right.
then you could call it an application. I mean, I bristle a little bit. I mean, application is just sort of common nomenclature out there that you would use here, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that thing that's sitting on your desktop that you double click. It doesn't necessarily have to be that to count.
I want to talk for a minute about, for lack of a better word, platformization in the application and solution delivery space. Is platformization, or rather, a sweeping up and away of smaller applications and trying to, use functionality that's built into your bigger platforms, is that for most organizations going to be, a desired outcome, a necessary outcome of this, or, is your mileage going to vary?
And I want to challenge the assertion of the question itself. Whether architecturally it's bundled in this thing we call a platform, or it's the separate app that's sitting somewhere. I mean, I don't know how important that is from an application rationalization point of view, right? I'll give you an example. Office 365 you could deem to be a platform. Office 365 sitting in Azure, I could call that a platform. You have a variety of different products that run within there. You have Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all these different ones, et cetera. If I was doing an application inventory, right? I mean, on some level, yes, I want to know that's part of that 365 platform, and that way maybe would have an impact on total cost of ownership and things of that sort. It's important from that point of view. But when I'm talking about taking an inventory of applications and determining whether or not I have coverage vis-a-vis my business capabilities and the things that I need to support, whether it's a platform or not is neither here nor there.
Yeah, and to that point, I only talk about platforms from a rationalization perspective in terms of what are we rationalizing against? Because it becomes a very awkward conversation to be rationalizing an ERP's module versus a Power Apps or some form of SaaS solution. So like to Ari's point, the applications that I want to include in my inventory, it doesn't really matter if it's part of a platform or not, or even motivating to migrate towards a platform. But if I'm looking at how I would like to kind of rationalize the application itself, I have to look at the context to say like, hey, does it actually make sense? Is it a fair comparison if I'm rationalizing a ERP module, for example, versus a standalone SaaS solution?
So I think, for me, there's an underlying, implicit assumption here that maybe we can challenge, which is, what I've brushed up against is there tends to be conventional wisdom in organizations that, if we have a platform that can do X, Y, and Z, we shouldn't go anywhere else to do X, Y, and Z. And if we've got other, vendors doing that's a problem. And that, if you take that to its extreme conclusion, it's like, well, why don't we just have everything under one roof, with one platform or one vendor? Would you challenge this rationale?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, it's an assertion you can make.
Yeah.
The challenge, and you could say that everything, falling under a single platform, a single vendor, let's say, maybe cost of ownership will be a bit less,
right,
which is one of the five lenses that we talk about in terms of how you should be evaluating your applications, but it's just one of those lenses. And so I just like with anything, you have those 5 different lenses you need to look it through. I would be mindful and look at things in balance there. Does it make sense to try to minimize the number of vendors and the number of platforms? Absolutely. Yeah. I would never recommend to our members that you do that blindly without a clear end goal in mind in terms of some set of metrics that you're looking to accomplish.
Yeah, it's definitely about fit for purpose.
Yes.
Because you try and bend it too far and it no longer fits the purpose, and you end up spending more trying to make that platform bend in a way that is not designed. So you can look at something as simple as, say, Salesforce versus Dynamics CRM. They're both platforms, but they both also have different use cases that one may be better than the other. if you think back historically, this is why we have multiple programming languages, because they were designed for different reasons to accomplish different goals. And that's no different with platforms these days, that they all have different purposes. There may be overlap, but what's your use case?
Right. I feel like we found ourselves sort of dancing around a really important question, which is like, what does success look like here and how you measure it? Is it literally just like, well, I have fewer applications today than I had 6 months ago, therefore the rationalization was a success? Or how can we actually measure that we did something impactful?
I like to kind of view success through 3 different lenses here. One of them is, what are the changes that I'm trying to get from my applications from a whole? Is it about, I want to increase end user satisfaction, I want to reduce operational costs, do I want to increase business productivity, those types of things. All of those would have to come out because I need to see some measurable difference in terms of how the applications are delivering value or solving a particular problem like Ari has mentioned. The second thing that I do want to kind of point out is the fact that we know that applications are going to decay over time. It's going to become shelfware the next day. So that just means that we have to ensure that it is routinely, regularly updated, maintained to help improve its value it's going to be delivered. So that means is, how do we actually see a successful application portfolio management practice? Right? How frequently are we actually doing application rationalization? How up to date is our inventory? Can we make reasonable decisions from there? And I think those are all indications of success, right? Because all of the effort I'm putting in initially in terms of doing my portfolio is not going to waste. As well as the very third thing that I've often talked about is the fact that as much as we want to boil the ocean when it comes down to rationalizing inventory or applications, it's not possible. Right? As much as we want to do that, it's not effectively possible for a lot of, especially large organizations. So we have to kind of take things in stride, right? So in our first iteration, what is our goal to do that? Well, it's to establish a practice, to establish a repeatable rationalization framework for some, is to help ensure we have the right people involved so then we can get motivated to do rationalization over. We need to have those champions.
I'm going to add that from a pure mechanic perspective when it comes to application rationalization. When you get to a point where application rationalization is really an evergreen process and not just an event, then you've won. That's, it should be something that like breathing for your organization.
It's a process, not a project.
It's a process, not a project. And this is something that I remember working with one of our government clients on this problem here, where it really was a painful event for different departments to say, okay, here are my applications, here's where I am. But very quickly, we've been getting them to a point where it's just something that they do. It's like, here are my applications, there's a centralized way of maintaining those, and then you can apply your rationalization approach on top of that, where it's just part of what we do.
Application rationalization is a tactic. It's not a strategy. You have an IT strategy, you have an ERP strategy, the big picture. Application rationalization is just a tactic that you use to achieve your IT strategy.
Yeah. And I want to kind of push on that even further because it's starting to become a little bit more of a common occurrence that I'm seeing with the members I've been speaking with, where people are using application rationalization, application portfolio management to help improve the branding or the reputation of IT. Because they do recognize that IT is there to help provide good, quality, valuable, productive types of applications to the organization. And unfortunately, that has often been strained because they're not delivering fast enough, or that it's not aligned to what their problems or their priorities are. So I've been seeing a lot more applications managers saying like, hey, why can't we use application portfolio management to help improve IT satisfaction, the net promoter scores, for example, of IT, because we are being recognized as being a good, reliable enabler, right, from a technology standpoint to the organization itself.
So the goal there is to figure out how you can actually improve user experience and kind of business value through rationalization.
And in fact, kind of improve the reputation of the organization to say like, hey, IT is a trusted partner because we provide valuable solutions.
Right. That makes sense. So bigger question, why is this so hard?
Well, it's a people problem, really. So that's why it's hard. Yeah. People, those who don't track it, it's not part of the process. So then it becomes, well, you don't know what you don't know. And that just creates that, how do I get started? Because I don't even know where to start. That is a people problem. And then that sort of bubbles out, and people don't never like to admit they don't actually know things. So they just push it to the side. Where I can do something else because I know how to do that.
I'll give an even harsher answer than that is, people love their stuff, right? And people love to own things, and people don't want to give up the things that they own. So you're dealing with it. I agree with Rob 100%. It's a people problem, but I take an even stronger view on it. It's an identity problem where people wrap up their identity because I am the such and such CRM owner, and I'm the master and commander of this thing. Well, rationalization might deem that to be, it's time to retire this. It's time to replace it. Maybe it's time to invest more. That's great. But people wrap up their own identity and feel their job security is based on this thing. Nobody wants to kick that hornet's nest because that creates all kinds of other problems.
We talked about this as, one of the use cases is like IT brand building, or reputation building. And to be honest, I kind of bristled at that because it just seems fraught with risk. Like I understand the rationale that through one lens, yes, we care about your experience. We want you to, make sure you have the best tools, but it absolutely feels like it can be invasive, right? It's the police open up, or, is that really a good use case? And if so, how do you avoid the perception that this is just like a painful audit?
One of the things that we try to get our members to think about is pick a right place to start with, right? I believe there's always somewhere in your organization where they're open.
Right.
Where they see the value of actually saying, like, here's everything that I have. Please let me know what I can do to help you out. There's always someone in the organization to do that. And I would say, reach out to them. They're going to be your champions going forward. And you want to use them to build a suitable set of tactics that you can use as a little bit of a toolbox in other areas of the organization, and leverage them as your players, as your promoters, as your champions.
So I want to add on to this, and I'll be open. I didn't love the assertion you made, and I didn't love the response in terms of it's not quite, I would call it brand building, but we're here to deliver value to the organization, and if we're moving away from that, well, too bad. We need to go fix that.
Right.
And when we look at application portfolio management or application rationalization, whichever term you want to use for this, this is really connected to other parts of what we call the overall solution delivery, right? We have both from a product lifecycle management point of view and from a product delivery point of view as well, with a solid governance layer that's sitting on top of it, and that application rationalization is meant to work with those with sort of those two other dimensions to help you deliver what's most important to the organization. There will be, through not only implementing rationalization, but being able to focus on your product management and your product delivery chops. There are cultural changes that will go along with that, because you kind of just have to in order to be successful at that. To try to get rid of those silos where somebody has wrapped up their entire identity in that. Yeah. Will that still happen? Of course it will.
Right.
But at the end of the day, IT's role is to be a partner, right? To deliver value to the organization. Anything else to me is just, I don't even have a good smart alecky thing to say about it, but it's really really delivery of value and working with the business to make sure that you're delivering what's most important is really what IT is there for.
Right.
Yeah, and part of that is addressing risk to the organization. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, that's what you're trying to do is de-risk your application portfolio.
Yeah.
And that's an important piece. And we have research on that in Embrace Business Managed Applications.
Yes.
That is about supporting the business, saying, hey, this is a low-risk application. Perfectly fine for a business to have that, and all IT needs to know is it's there. Mm-hmm. 2, something with high risk, high complexity, really needs business to be the partner. So an ERP or a CRM, these are high value, high risk products that derive a lot of value within the organization. That's where IT needs to be partnered with the organization.
Right. So I want to I want to pick up on a few different things that have come out here and talk a little bit more about like the implementation and execution side of this, right? Because, Ari, as you mentioned, there's like, you can have product managers for these. People's like, this is political, this is personal as well as professional. This is people's livelihoods attached to this.
Absolutely.
And, Rob, you mentioned the organization that has 15 ERPs. Well, I don't need to do a full assessment to know that 15 is not the right number of ERPs for them. But, how many jobs are tied up individually to, I run this component of this ERP. So this is, this has real consequences. And, we're going to, I have to imagine, run into parts of the organization, to people or to divisions that say like, don't touch this, it's mine, right? And it's locally that makes sense for them, but when we talk about the organization, it's not right for the organization. So how do we make sure this report isn't shelfware, that it's not, these are our recommendations? How do you actually get from 15 ERPs down to 1 to 5 to whatever the right number is? How do you put this into practice?
Like any IT change or any change at all, it's organizational change management. It's a fundamental piece to this. You can do all the application rationalization and come up with a great report that says this is what we need to do. But without the organizational change management piece to sell the change to the organization, it's going to fail.
I wish I could disagree with him, but I can't. I guess it is a change management problem. This is where, as you're pushing along, and if you're taking this seriously, that's where, I'll give you an example. Actually, working with a member a few years ago on this, that they realized that they didn't have proper ownership and accountability for a whole whack of their applications, and they started to go through this. Right? It doesn't matter what they recommend. There's nobody that really owns that. So they started putting a stronger product ownership structure into place, an application ownership structure into place, so that there was someone that was, and I affectionately use the term throat to choke. There was that one throat to choke for this application, whether maybe that individual is getting more, that individual application or platform is getting more investment. Maybe it's being retired. Maybe it's being replaced. And when you're doing, and again, I don't want to change the topic to product ownership, but it's important to understand when you're talking about product ownership, you're not necessarily, ideally, you're not talking about someone that's just the owner of the XYZ application. It's about the capability that's being delivered there. They own that.
Without ownership and accountability, you end up with a sprawling application portfolio. So as an organization, this really needs to be part of your overall IT and business strategy to drive the whole thing, to prevent it from happening and to fix what's already happened. I think you need to step back and say, as an organization, we need to understand this so that we can fix what we have and prevent it from happening in the future, really mature ourselves.
Thanks, gentlemen, for joining. This has been super insightful. I really appreciate the conversation.
Great to be here, Jeff. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So Andrew, the research methodology you've come up with here talks about taking a 5 lenses approach to rationalizing your applications portfolio. Can you maybe walk us through what those 5 lenses are and how we can use them?
Sure. The real purpose of those 5 lenses is to transform a jumbled number of applications, push it through lenses or filters, so to speak, to come out with a set of applications and a set of dispositions or action items that is required to help improve them, get more health. You don't need all of these lenses to be successful until you just got to pick the ones that just make the most sense based on the decisions that you want to make. With that said, the 5 lenses are application alignment. So you have to kind of understand in terms of how applications are supporting the organization itself, whether that's aligning it to business capabilities or business departments, whatever the case is. But you have to understand in terms of how applications are being used and leveraged within the organization. The next one is what we call organizational value or business value, depending on where you're coming from. And that's really about how does the applications really kind of support value, revenue generation, cost reduction, or what I'm trying to get members to start thinking about a little bit more is about branding and reputation, especially when it comes down to external or outfacing ones, or even internally with regarding to employee satisfaction and engagement. The other lenses is technical health. So you can kind of think of this as all of the ITIs, right? Your scalability, your maintainability, your availability, right? These are all the technical attributes that you need to accommodate as part of your evaluation. And this is kind of where IT would really kind of lend a hand in terms of, hey, do I have a security risk here, or do I have some issues with uptime, for example? The other lens is actually another one that I'm getting more and more members to kind of start thinking about, and that's really about the end user perspective. Because how do we ensure that we're successful if the end users are not actually using it, right? So they have to be able to use it. So that's kind of why a couple of questions that we often do ask is, how satisfied are you with the features? How satisfied you are with the usability? How critical you are with with those applications being used? So is it actually part of your practice? How satisfied are you with the accuracy, with the reliability of the data that's being processed? So there's a lot of things to actually think about from the end user perspective, because we're not going to be successful if they're not effectively using it. The very last one is TCO, or the total cost of ownership, and that's really about, of course, how much cost does it actually take to actually operate it long term, whether that's from a licensing cost, vendor cost, consulting costs, that sort of thing. And like I mentioned, not all of these lenses are going to be ultimately important to your decision making, but definitely kind of fit top of mind, right, as possible perspectives to accommodate as part of your decision making.
Well, and it sounds like as you go through this exercise, it's important to keep all 5 of those in mind so you can at least figure out which of those are most important to you. And if you don't want to, if you want to deprioritize one, that's a conscious decision, not, an accident.
Correct, because we do have a couple of patterns that we've been seeing with certain types of organizations. It just depends on why you're actually doing application portfolio management is going to be the big one. Like, for example, sometimes for government organizations, like I mentioned, I don't want to say they don't care about your TCO, but sometimes in terms of the people I've been working with, not as important as organizational value or technical health. So that's kind of why whenever we kind of get in conversation with our members, we start asking them, hey, what are the key influential factors that will help you make a decision? And then just focus on that.
Right. So with that in mind, Andrew, can you walk me through the methodology we recommend for actually rationalizing your application portfolio?
Sure, of course. So before we kind of get into it, there's always 2 big questions I always end up asking. Why are we doing this? And how do you define applications? Without those 2, it becomes very difficult to identify, hey, what are the pilot projects I want to undertake? Because as much as I want to say, boil the ocean, you don't want to boil the ocean on that side, right? So we want to make sure that we are being very thoughtful in terms of where we want to go with it. But like we discussed earlier, we also do want to make sure that the scope of our inventory of our rationalization is manageable. So that's kind of where that definition of applications will effectively fit in. Then we get into the next round where we definitely want to figure out in terms of what is the alignment of those applications. So which applications are supporting which business capabilities, which applications are supporting which processes, so we can understand what the sprawl is like, what's the business criticality is like, what are the different gaps or shadow IT is happening, right, and foster that type of discussion. Then the next step is around, let's kind of inventory your application. So unfortunately, this is a lot of the grunt work that ends up happening, where you say, hey, what are the applications within my portfolio? Let's identify who's the SME is, or the subject matter expert is, who's going to be supporting it, how many users, right? The amount of information that you would kind of compile in that is really dependent on who's going to be using that inventory. So we definitely do want to make sure that that inventory is right size based on the primary user of that inventory. The next step is around rationalization. So I would like to kind of break this up into 2 pieces. One of them is, let's spend some time to figure out what is our rationalization framework. So looking at all of the lenses, right, understanding in terms of what questions we want to ask and what are the outcomes that we want to gain from that. And that takes a little bit of crafting to figure out what's the appropriate questions that we want to ask. The second part about that is, let's actually go about rationalizing it. And this has also been a very challenging part for many organizations, because we have our own assumptions in terms of what are those applications are entailing. But there are a lot of challenges with actually making assumptions right from that. So that's kind of why do workshops, do one-on-one interviews, do some form of collaborative sessions with your end users or business stakeholders with certain technical expertise, right? Just to make sure that, hey, if I'm going to be giving it a score of 5, it's actually a score of 5, right? It's not just something that I think it's a score of 5. So we definitely do want to make sure that it's a reasonable assessment. The next step is about, based on our rationalization, what is the dispositions or the outcomes? And let's kind of illustrate that as part of a roadmap. let's understand as to when do we believe that we want to retire it? When do we want to believe we want to modernize it? When do we believe we want to update it, right? And provide some insights in terms of what is that roadmap, one cycle or 1 quarter out, 1 year out, 2 years out, for example, to kind of give a little bit of an indication of what does that entail. So this is not necessarily part of the blueprint itself, but there are other things I will also do recommend as part of this. One of them is the fact that application portfolio management is typically done by people who are not decision makers as part of the applications themselves. So the people who are doing application portfolio management has to pitch it, has to communicate that, has to be able to say like, hey, here are my recommendations and here's why these are my recommendations. It's just unfortunately, a lot of the folks I've been speaking with are not strong in that area. So we need to help them build up that storyline, that the narrative, right, to kind of get people to be very confident, at least as those decision makers, in the recommendations that they're going to accommodate as part of their decisions. And the very last thing I do want to kind of point out is that what's the governance is going to be like, right? So like we talked about earlier, right, this is not a one and done type of thing. It's a reoccurring type of activity. And with reoccurrence, that requires role definitions, requires process flows, requires even a good tool to help manage this at scale.
I want to come back to this notion of artifacts and what you walk away with. And Andrew, you mentioned this recommendations report, this roadmap. Is that kind of the ultimate artifact? And can you walk me through what that looks like and any other artifacts that get created along the way?
Yeah. So there is that one big tool that we do provide that kind of walks you through everything from let's define your goals and objectives, let's document what your definition of your application is, all the way through to roadmap. And that's our application rationalization tool. And it's really there to help you facilitate the actual exercises that you can use as a basis to kind of go forward. We do have other types of materials as well that can help you out. Like, for example, we do have a document that illustrates the governance around that, your roles and responsibilities, your process flow associated with that, right? Just to make sure that you have it somewhere, right? That is defined, right? And that's that you can refer to whenever you're actually going about this type of initiative. And the other thing that we do have is regarding to a high level of maturity assessment of your application itself, right? Is it defined? Are there certain gaps within my practice, right? Because we definitely do want to make sure that we're being very thoughtful in terms of the effort that we want to put into it. And that maturity assessment is really there to help you determine what is appropriate actions to take.
Got it. So as we walk through this entire process, how long does that take to do typically? And are there spots we can kind of, really accelerate the process with concentrated effort?
It's a very tough initiative, and it always comes back to why we're doing this, right? And the purpose scope associated with that. Because I often recommend our members to say, hey, if I'm going down the application portfolio management side of things, what's the one outcome or the primary outcome they want to achieve as part of this iteration? Mm-hmm. I often recommend stick with one business unit and stick with one area of the organizations to work with, so that when you're doing your rationalization, you only need to talk with one group of people. When you're looking at your application portfolio, you only need to reach out to one group, right? And that reduces a lot of the complexity, which allows you to focus on figuring out what your practice it is going to be. Then you rinse and repeat. So if you're going to take that approach, and if you're going through a guided implementation with us roughly every 2 weeks, you can, from a guesstimate around that, around 2 to 3 months around that. Because a lot of the effort that is required is on just the mining of the information as well as the rationalization side of things.
Right. Oh, I love that. Andrew, this has been such an interesting discussion. Thanks so much for your insight today.
I'm happy to be here.
Amazing. And for anyone interested in rationalizing your application portfolio, check out the full blueprint at infotech.com.